format for today. So I am delighted that we are launching the All-Ireland Cluster Research Network report. Welcome, everybody. By way of introduction to our event today, let me introduce you to the CRN team. We have Professor Eleanor Doyle, Dr. Owen McGuinness, Dr. John Hobbs, and myself, Clodagh Barry. We are joined this afternoon by Damien McConville, InterTradeIreland, and Dr. Christian Kettles, Harvard Business School. Key topics in discussion today are the gap analysis, the report itself, a look at the strategic operation of clusters internationally, and the next steps for clustering. For our format today, we will have 3 presentations, one from Eleanor, Christian, and Owen. Please pose questions via the Q&A function. Today's presentations are being recorded. At 2:50, we will move to a moderated question and answer panel with John and with the speakers. We will close at 3:13 p.m. I will now hand you over to Damien and we can get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Clodagh, and thanks everyone for attending. So as Clodagh said, my name is Damien McConville. I'm the Synergy Programme Manager with InterTradeIreland, and I worked with the team very closely on the report. So I'm not going to speak for too long. I'm going to hand over to Eleanor in a wee second, but I just wanted to take the time to thank the CRN team for all the work they've done through 6 very intensive workshops, all the work that went on in the background, and then pulling together their thoughts and the insights into completing and compiling this report. I appreciate that the report was only made live on, I think it was Thursday afternoon, but if you haven't had time to read the report, please do take the time and have a read. When you read it, you will agree with me that the quality held within it is second to none. So briefly, why do InterTradeIreland see the value in this report? Well, from the start, it has always aimed to, and it has taken on board the views across the whole clustering spectrum, looking at the views from cluster managers, from SMEs participating in clusters, through to academics and policymakers. And that holistic approach is very, very important. So it hasn't come from one angle, it's come from many angles to understand the full circle impact on clusters. Secondly, is the all-island makeup, very important for InterTradeIreland, and it's what our remit is all about. But even looking at the membership of the actual cluster research network, being from Northern Ireland and from Ireland, and crucially, the participation rates across the workshops, and these are the people's views who are now compiled within the report, and it's been roughly 2/3 Ireland and 1/3 Northern Ireland. That third piece is very, very important, and I think that when you read the report, comes across in how important it is to have the views and the balanced view from each side of the border. And thirdly, when you look at the gaps that the CRN have identified, with the gaps, they have also identified opportunities. There's opportunities to help develop the clustering landscape in Ireland, opportunities in Northern Ireland, and again, crucially for InterTradeIreland, there's opportunities to strengthen the all-island and the cross-border pieces. I'm not going to go into detail about the report, but there's threads in the report that are happening already. So the key thing is strengthening and building up that cluster landscape. So I'll just hand on over to Professor Eleanor Doyle from UCC.
Thank you, Damien. So it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to present the findings and the background to our clustering report, Clustering on the Island of Ireland, a Gap Analysis. It was a great pleasure to be able to work on this with a group of interested colleagues across the Cluster Research Network, which we developed because of our interest in clustering. And it was wonderful to be able to work on the project together with the funded support through the Synergy Programme. The Synergy Programme aligns with our focus here in the report because it targets enhancing participation of SMEs in innovative networks, including entrepreneurs, academics, policymakers, third sector participants, actors across all of the system really. And so as clustering is very useful in that context, it aligned very well with our own interest. So in the report, I will take you through our approach, the background context, and then the findings for our engagement with a wide range of stakeholders. So in terms of the general context of this project, beginning with the aims of our gap analysis, we wanted to examine and inform the operation and strategic development of clusters across the island. We use the approach of a gap analysis in terms of identifying challenges and potential routes to addressing those challenges. We're aware of the extent to which there has been and is ongoing engagement in terms of different types of clustering activity in practice and in policy. So we wanted to, in as much as we could in a project like this, bring as much of that experience to bear as possible. We wanted to elicit the broadest amount of feedback that we could possibly engage in terms of perceived challenges and opportunities. We wanted the report to be informed by input from identified key actors and players in the cluster landscape. And that's why we identified the 6 different stakeholder groups that we did. So what we wanted to focus on was perceptions of where we are now in terms of the Northern Ireland landscape, the Republic of Ireland landscape, but to do this on an all-island basis, bring various stakeholders together within each of our workshops. We wanted to identify improvements then in terms of both practice and policy, leveraging the experience, the challenges and opportunities as perceived across these 6 different stakeholder groups. So we identified key sources of expertise in terms of cluster policy and practice across stakeholder groups of cluster managers, local economic development personnel, regional economic development personnel, cluster business leaders and directors, policymakers not included in the other categories, and then academic researchers. So we arranged a series of workshops, one for each of those stakeholder groups, to elicit their views in terms of key challenges and potential opportunities that they would then create within the cluster landscape. And the approach we took was to organize between September and November of last year, 6 stakeholder groups in the order as they're presented here, beginning with the cluster managers, who were, I guess, closest to the coalface in terms of dealing with challenges and opportunities. And it was interesting to gain the perspectives from each stakeholder group. They had an opportunity, I guess, in each of these networking events to be introduced to a wider group of people with similar roles to themselves, and to identify to what extent similar challenges and issues were raised wherever on the island these issues were presenting themselves. So for each of our workshops, we organized to try and complete each session within around a 2-hour gap. We provided invitations in advance with prompts in terms of the types of questions we wished to deal with, to provide as much by way of background, I guess, and some certainty in terms of the guiding posts for the organization of the stakeholder meetings. Each of our meetings then consisted of a mix of plenary, where we kept the group together, and then depending on the size of the group, we tended to break out into smaller groups so that everyone would have the opportunity to engage in dialogue, and we would, attempt in as much as we could in the time available to ensure that as much of the information and knowledge that people wished to share were shared across wider groups. And irrespective of which group we spoke to, our central focus, and I guess the structure of our workshops, was very similar. We had 3 guiding questions. What is their organization's experience with clusters and clustering? What challenges for cluster exist from their organization's perspective? And what policy or implementation supports would be required in order to improve on current practice? In terms of our process, immediately after each of our stakeholder workshops, we transcripted our discussions. We took as much simultaneous notes as we could, but we opted not to record any of the sessions. It enhances the possibility for open and frank discussion, nor did we attribute in the document any of the issues raised to any individuals or groups. That wasn't our goal or our purpose. And in terms of coming up with our recommendations, we analysed each of the sets of feedback from each stakeholder workshop with the view to identifying where there was resonance across the discussions. And there was quite an amount of resonance. And there is a table 1 from the report outlines in very broad terms, I guess, what our gap analysis allowed us to arrive. So according to our 3 questions, we have some information here in terms of cluster experience, challenges, and I guess the mirror for those challenges then created some opportunities as well, as we discussed with each stakeholder group the extent to which issues arose for them. Each of the themes that we've identified for discussion in the report was raised by at least 4 different stakeholder groups. Sometimes there are gaps where issues were not raised by a particular group. There might be an empty cell perhaps under workshop 3 under active involvement. And I just wanted to report that they may have said there was perhaps not active involvement up to this point in time, but the people at the workshops envisaged a role. They had an active interest and could see, perhaps because they were new to the role, they could see the importance of engagement and greater networking within the clustering field. So that was our overall sense of information. We collated that and organized it and essentially refined it down into, I guess, 3 headline areas. And for each of the headline areas, we've identified a number of recommendations. So I can take you through those now. One very general issue focused on the sense of confusion in terms of the definition, I guess, around the term cluster. Not so much that people were unclear, I think, at this stage, because it's a term that has been around now for quite some time. But in terms of its operationalization, it tends to be used in very different ways in terms of our policy and practice. So our recommendation to move to clarity is addressing that definitional confusion, which we say is likely to continue without departmental leadership across the island. And we see that departmental leadership driving ahead in terms of then, moving on from definition to bringing greater clarity, or allowing for greater clarity to be brought in terms of goals for clusters, for their programs, with specific criteria that are clearly understood and agreed in terms of what we are talking about when we use the term. So for that, we argue that we recommend that leadership and buy-in is required at national government levels. And that really is a precursor, but a necessary fundamental precursor to allowing clustering programs of substance, which would be aligned with international best practice, to be formalized. And they then can serve to drive further competitiveness in key areas of national importance across the island. With that agreement around definitions for both, what constitutes a cluster in the economic sense, what cluster organizations might look like given international best practice, and what types of cluster initiatives could be put together through different types of programs. We think those definitions could be very useful if agreed and then applied across policy programs and the cluster infrastructure that we see as nascent in a lot of the island, with some pockets, I think, of better and best practice evident as well. Our second key theme that emerged was around policy development and policy implementation, and the need to really take account of how clustering research has evolved And because it's, in policy and practice terms, it has been around for over 20 years plus at this stage, that the research itself has moved into discussing things like cluster life cycles, the relationship of clusters for both mature and quite new industries, and how there are different scales in terms of geographic and resources at which clusters best operate. And that these now can be developed in terms of policy with very clear goals and targets that pay due service to issues of life cycle, evolution, stages of development really, and acknowledging that different clusters will have different needs depending on their level of development and maturity. We also recommend establishing of some centralized cluster financing programs with agreed views on what the types of key performance indicators should be. And again, they would be different for different clusters at different stages of development to be discussed and identified within those different contexts. And the timing here is a key issue in terms of our stakeholder feedback. Our final issue relates to learning, education, and career progression. And it emerged that there is quite a gap when it comes to the development of the types and I guess the basket of professionalized skills that cluster managers as a group would need in terms of supporting and delivering on the needs and demands of different cluster organizations. And it's possible to extend some of what is currently on offer, I think, again, in some small pockets of examples across the island, to consider ways of making those types of educational and CPD types of supports more streamlined and more standardized. And essentially through recommendation 5, we see provision of professional and accredited training as being required really to support career progression opportunities for cluster managers and people working in this area, to develop the system itself, to support the SMEs, to support the development of the cluster membership. And then our final recommendation relates again to this, but it is bigger than just the learning and education of this cadre of professionals. It speaks to a broader range and availability of resources and systems to connect the professionals who are interested, whether they be businesses looking to join up with other members of similar types of clusters, to become aware of what's actually out there in terms of the cluster system. So we see a centralized hub being very, having the capacity to provide some really supportive infrastructure in allowing clusters to develop. And that in brief really is our report. I'm going to hand you over now to Dr. Christian Ketels, who's a global expert in clusters, and he's been working for 2 decades plus on this area. He works at Harvard Business School in and with Professor Michael Porter's Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. He's also worked very closely with the leading practitioner cluster organization, TCI, and he's currently serving as chair of their board. And he wishes to talk to us for the next session, focusing on clustering for the island of Ireland. Many thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, for this presentation of the report, which I really enjoyed reading. I think there's a lot of materials in there that's really worthwhile and hopefully will guide policymakers moving forward. As Damien pointed out, if you haven't already done so, do have a look at the report. It's very well done and very worthwhile information. So what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about what I saw in this report and how this might look like if you take an outside view on what's going on the island of Ireland. First of all, I was very happy to see that this continues to be an all-island effort. As we know, this is not an easy situation for kind of coordinating activities across the entire island. It's great to see that this is one of the areas where there is so much common interest and common will to do something. So really encourage you to continue on that path. I do think, what one has to realize that this new context that the island is facing will also spill over into the cluster effort. So I think, clarity in how to deal with the type of issues that will come up are one of the things that might come up further down the road. Didn't come up much in this report, but I think it is important to be open about these type of things, because then you can solve any issue that might evolve. Not talking about potential barriers, I think, is not to the benefit of all of your interests, whether in Northern Ireland or in the Republic of Ireland on these type of issues. Now, going right into the report itself. First of all, I want to congratulate the team, the colleagues that have worked on this, a very sound piece of analysis. I also want to encourage you in that broader cluster community in Ireland to really use this asset, the cluster research network that has been created in Ireland. You really have a huge opportunity to have such a committed local group of researchers with you. It's a group of researchers that's very action-oriented, and I think this is exactly what you need to do to develop your policy further. You need people that understand how to work with data, that understand the theory, but really that do their analysis with a view on how you can improve practice moving forward. We've seen the importance of similar type of institutions in a few other parts of the world that have been really leading in terms of applying cluster-based economic development concepts. I think this is an asset really for you to draw on as you move forward. Now, when I looked at the report, I think the first observation from the outside is that it's sort of answering the question on how do we get this right? How do we look at the cluster policy, the cluster efforts that exist in Ireland, and make them better? What are the gaps that the report identifies, and what are potential solutions to address those? And we've just heard from Eleanor a number of great recommendations, on definitions and data and the need for national policy, but also thoughtful ideas on funding. And in particular, I think training and career path actually are quite important. One of the key findings of a lot of the cluster research is that at the end of the day, this is about people. It's about individuals that are connecting activities across the business community, across government, across academia. So having the right type of individuals do this is absolutely crucial. So I really don't have any squibbles or comments on these type of recommendations. What I would like to do, though, is to step back a little bit and say, is this really the question that especially the critics and those that will have to sign off on a national policy for clusters are worried about? And my answer would be in part, of course, they are worried about, how can we make those cluster efforts be more impactful? But I think they're even more worried about the prior question, which is, are these actually the right efforts? Should we be concerned about cluster efforts overall? What's really their role into the broader policy mix? So let me talk a little bit about these issues and what I see emerging from the international evidence on these questions, because I think then we can have a much more productive discussion, not only within our group of people that are sort of convinced that this is a tool that's worthwhile and that is valuable also for Ireland to apply in economic development, but also for those that might have questions, that are open to the idea, but they want to be convinced that this is actually the tool that they should use versus a lot of other things that they could try to do in order to enhance economic development in a specific geography. Now, of course, the key reason that many people argue that a cluster-based approach makes sense is the empirical evidence that those locations that have strong regional concentrations of related and supporting industries in specific fields, i.e. have strong presence of clusters, actually turn out to be doing better. We do see that a lot of the economic activity across sectors is very concentrated in a few locations. We find that in North America and Europe, also in many emerging economies where now data has become available, we see that is primarily through higher productivity. So we see those activities really becoming better, more innovative, more productive, more value adding if they are located in clusters. Maybe surprisingly, we've also seen that in fact, clusters have turned out to be more resilient in the face of shocks, whether economic shocks, as we've seen them in the global financial crisis and then the European sovereign debt crisis, but also in other situations like now with relation to COVID and the pandemic and kind of global supply chains. What we've seen is kind of networks of companies are together more able to readjust, find new markets, use their capabilities in different ways than narrow, isolated companies. And that really is the right type of comparison. It's not a fully diversified economy with strong positions in many sectors. That's not the alternative for many locations. The question is, do I have some strong clusters or do I have no strong clusters and kind of very dispersed economic activity across my economy? So I think even on resilience, which was a point that a lot of people have been questioning, we see that clusters are actually much stronger. We also have seen a lot of evidence over the last couple of years on relatedness, which is one of the key factors that influences structural change. So how are regional and national economies developing over time? How is the mix of different types of economic development, economic activities over time changing? We do see that is happening through relatedness. There's a lot of literature on economic complexity that looks at this as well. So it means understanding your clusters today means understanding what opportunity paths you have in your future. Working with your clusters today does not mean kind of blocking yourself in what you've always done, but it means actively looking at what are the most likely areas for economic development going forward. So there's all this good evidence then that basically shows, having cluster is a good thing. But the reality is that there are also a lot of other factors that matter for success, for innovation, for productivity, for entrepreneurship, for economic growth. And even within clusters, as I mentioned, there's a debate on whether it's really about having a strong clusters or having a cluster in the right field, like IT, life sciences, or other advanced kind of higher wage, higher productivity services. So how does this fit into the broader picture if we want to understand economic performance? Well, we've looked at that recently with a drawing on a new data set of European clusters, so all EU NUTS 2 regions that we looked at that. And we really try to find out what are the different factors here. Cluster presence, where we looked at the concentration of economic activity in specific related and supporting industries. Framework conditions, so we grabbed a couple of general things like skills and infrastructure that give you a sense of how productive in general location can be. And then cluster mix, whether or not you are specialized more in sectors that are generally higher wage, higher productive, more innovative. And what we find is that, maybe not surprisingly, if you look individually at all of these three factors, all of them are positively associated with higher levels of prosperity and productivity. So a lot of different things, all of them do matter for outcomes. The interesting stuff happens if you kind of throw them in together and figure out, how are they related to each other and which of those are more important. So let's first look at the question of cluster mix. And what we find is that, not surprisingly, as I said, if you are in more advanced sectors like IT or financial services, you tend to be a more prosperous location. But if you control for the quality of your business environment, it turns out that cluster mix is what economists call endogenous. So as your location becomes more competitive overall, there is a natural tendency to shift towards higher value added, more productive sectors. What that means for policy is that moving into these sectors is kind of not an independent, separate driver, but it's sort of the result of your general upgrading activities that you do. So mix is important, but probably not so important as a policy tool, but as an outcome and an indicator that you are moving in the right direction as a location. So what about cluster presence? Well, it turns out that cluster presence is not fully endogenous to framework conditions. Clusters are strong or can be strong at all levels of competitiveness and economic development. And they are sort of an additional way for really using the type of competitiveness fundamentals that you have in your regional economy to the fullest extent. So cluster strength, having effective dynamic cluster environments, is useful and beneficial at all levels of economic development, although it might happen that in different types of clusters as you kind of become more prosperous over time. So this gives a little bit more background on how should we think about the role that cluster efforts can play, both what they should focus on, but also why they are important in the overall set of policies to drive economic development. So let's make that next step towards thinking about policy, because a lot of the evidence that I showed so far, actually all of the evidence that I've shown so far, says nothing about policy. It only talks about the evidence on how locations look like and how that is systematically related to economic outcomes. Rightly, critics say that, yeah, you know, clusters exist, no question about it, but they emerge naturally. So why is there a case for an intervention? So if we think about this, you know, one way that helps me to kind of untangle this discussion is this graph that you just see in front of you on your screen. So if you think on the horizontal line from the left to the right, we think more clusters, more agglomeration. So you know what usually cluster enthusiasts argue for. On the vertical axis, you have the quality of the business environment, so the general competitiveness of the location. As I said, usually these things kind of go together. You have stronger clusters and you have clusters in more advanced sectors, more productive sectors, as you improve your business environment. But what does that mean for policy? So the traditional way to think about this, and I think still the dominant view of thinking about cluster policy among those that are quite critical or not so close to the cluster community, is that cluster policy is basically moving along the horizontal line. So creating clusters, clustering is about having more clusters. There's a case for that, but the question, of course, is that unless you also improve competitiveness overall, often these are very short-sighted, very risky efforts. As soon as you don't subsidize these activities, they die off. So I think what we've seen in the cluster community is much more this movement in the with these blue arrows on the vertical line. So using clusters as a way to organize competitiveness, as a way to enhance the business environment with the focus on specific cluster categories in which you are active as a regional economy. So doing economic development, but doing it smarter, doing it more focused, doing it more integrated towards the need of specific sectors that you have in your community. And I think the difference between the two is kind of in the time profile and the risk of these efforts. These red efforts, you know, especially with tax incentives and so on, can be very effective in the short term if you manage to kind of create a lot of economic activity in that sector. But it might not be sustainable unless you really change the fundamental competitiveness of your location. The blue efforts, what are usually the cluster-based efforts, take longer time. They are not so risky, but you have to recognize that this is a journey. It's about doing things in economic policy that you anyway do, but doing them better over time in a more integrated fashion. It's very important, I think, to communicate these two different ways of how we think about cluster policy, especially outside our community of sort of cluster enthusiasts that kind of understand this and have kind of inherited these type of ideas. Now, the second issue, which I think is quite important for both those that are already convinced of that and those that are not convinced, is that there are many different ways to organize these cluster efforts. And this is maybe more the clustering that the report talks about. We know that there are different sets of factors that affect the impact of cluster initiatives and cluster-based economic development. You know, what you do, how aligned it is with the needs of your local economy, what the overall context is. So is there an underlying cluster to work with, or is this just a political dream that you're trying to realize? What's the trust, the collaboration, the quality of the institutions in your cluster, and so on. And then finally, also the resources and capabilities of your cluster organization. I think what we've seen is kind of there are almost two polar cases that have emerged internationally. One is what I call here the narrow model, which is a little bit of money for essentially some networking. A few people, a lot of a secretariat. You basically try to bring people together. You try to overcome those bridges in communication and collaboration that some of the cluster researchers have talked so much about, and that can be very important. In fact, it is probably critical in some of the locations where that is the ingredient that's missing. It is, however, also limited because it means that these cluster efforts themselves don't have much resources. They have very few tools to really change the reality around companies or their behavior. And so that systemic model down there is one that goes one step further and says, we not only set up a little bit of networking entity, but we really use these cluster initiatives as a strategic instrument to deliver, design, and kind of integrate economic policy actions throughout our cluster. We want them to identify where the priorities are and then deploy the different tools that government has available to address these issues jointly. Here's an example from Denmark. In the slides that we're sharing, there are a few other examples. Denmark is an interesting example because they have really over the years developed a very powerful community of clusters. They veered a little bit between the local and the national. So first they had kind of national sectoral efforts. Challenge was that these were often not very well grounded or anchored in the dynamism of the local clusters that we know drive so much of the activity. Then they went local. Turned out that the local efforts themselves in a small country like Denmark just didn't have the critical mass. In many sectors, there is a dominant hub, but then there's activities also in other parts of the country. And if you exclude them, you basically don't get the activity that you need. So this is where they ended up now. They just restructured their cluster system. They now have cluster organizations that are locally anchored in their strong clusters, but that have a national agenda, a national purpose. And they have, aligned with what Eleanor, as in her last recommendation, suggested. They have Cluster Excellence Denmark sort of as a national platform to do some data work, to kind of challenge each other, and also then to work with the national government on different issues. So definitely an example that's worthwhile looking at. Now, let me close with some thoughts on what I see is a crucial issue for Ireland, the island of Ireland to decide upon. And that's really, what is the ambition that you have for your cluster efforts? And I've termed this here a choice, but it's not an either or. It is actually an and question. One option, I think, is that you can focus on better SME development, which I think has been a central theme of a lot of the policy documents that I've seen on clusters in Ireland. A more ambitious option, which I think is at least worthwhile considering, is to think about the role of clusters in a broader kind of competitiveness strategy for Ireland. I'll lay out shortly why I think that might be useful. The important thing here is that depending on that choice, you want to create the right type of structure in terms of your clustering efforts, your cluster organizations. You want to be clear based on that strategic choice on what the objectives are, how you organize it, how you fund it, and how you train people. And that depends on where you want to go. And I think that clarity might be one of the root causes of why there is a little bit of fragmentation around the efforts at the moment, and a lack of clarity, which I think now has been associated with the lack of definitional clarity, which I think is a bit of an excuse, because I think we've gone over that bridge many years ago. Now on SME development, so if you continue on the current path, I think the key is really to use cluster data to better channel the type of efforts that are going on already in different parts of Ireland to help SMEs become better, to export, to innovate, to upgrade their skills, and so on. So you can focus on collaboration between relevant sets of SMEs, and you can focus much more, I would believe, using the cluster organizations as a channel to deploy the programs the different parts of the Irish government and the Northern Ireland government already provide to these type of firms. I think there is much more than can be done. So don't see the clusters as kind of a separate silo of the SME toolkit, but make it a central way of delivering improvements to SMEs. I think that's where the opportunity lies, that is quite close and consistent with what you're already doing. A further step would really be to talk about competitiveness, and this is the last slide that I want to end with. I do think Ireland, and here maybe more focus on the Republic of Ireland, is faced with a quite clear challenges in terms of how it's going to compete in the future. The old model with relatively low taxes, access to the EU market, and so on, I think is being challenged. I think we know that the tax rules are being reviewed across the world, especially the tech-intensive companies that are very important to the Republic, kind of are more under the microscope by policymakers. So it's not obvious that this sustainable competitive advantage will be sustainable. We also see that there is a lot of questions around the nature of growth that has been occurring in the Republic of Ireland, so high housing costs and all of those type of things. If there is a case to look at Ireland's competitiveness in a more coherent, overarching way, cluster data is part of the analytics that needs to be done. Cluster actions are part of the tools that can help you to deliver coherent actions. And the initiatives that we already have, I think, then could be upgraded to play a much bigger role in efficient public-private dialogue in order to enhance the competitiveness of the Irish economy going forward. So with that, let me close and hand it over to Arian. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Christian. I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully that's working now. So basically, I've just a couple of slides really here to finish out this part of the discussion before we get over into the Q&A section of today's session. I think Christian and Eleanor have both raised a lot of issues. So really, I just want to concentrate on a few questions or indeed maybe pointers as to where I think next steps might come, both north and south. And I think I'm thinking here next steps in terms of the context of that we're at a certain stage in terms of, I think both Christian and Eleanor have laid that out well in terms of support for clustering, or support in many cases for business networking as well. And what we want to do to sort of take that to another level, we're at the stage where sort of we're approaching bringing in better and best practice there. So in terms of kind of the next steps, I think I lifted this really out of the report, but in a sense just wanted to highlight a number of things in terms of how we might close the gaps that we've identified in the report. I come back and this is a point. I think Christian is spot on this. What I'm saying here, that we need to be brave with definitions in terms of the policy design stage that we're at, both north and south. I think at the same time we can't allow an ongoing or indeed open-ended discussion to go on forever and ever on this point. I think there's the elements that we need to see are, in my view, fairly clear, really. Clusters are fairly clear around the geographical concentration, particularly in the early stages, around the interconnections of actors there, and those can be competitive or collaborative or both. And that the bottom issue there, going back to Michael Porter, that we share common or indeed related knowledge base, technology sector, or product market. Those things need to be there, in terms of that. And to be, as I say, kind of still ruminating over that seems to me to be maybe missing the point here, that the definitions, I think, are quite clear. We need to be clear in our head what they are and just move on from that point. I think then perhaps in terms of delivery, and I've used the kind of title here, that one thing we might want to at least debate, if not try and sort of fix in on, is prioritization here. And I've used the kind of idea that is it possible for us on the island, on either side of the island, or doing this on an all-island basis, to actually move away from the fact that we have to say that there's one for everyone in the audience? That in a sense we might need to sort of think about, what does prioritization mean? What does commitment mean in the longer term? And I think, you know, we then try and prioritize. I've thrown up a few things that where we might prioritize around, be it the development of, you know, greater technology or sectoral strengths. Is the goal really around, and these can be a number of things at the same time, be it the development of a better level of trust. Is it around potential to grow market share? And I mean here really internationally. So, you know, sectors or clusters on the island are there to try and, you know, assist the island as a whole, or the two parts of the island, to actually grow market share off the island. It's not it's more than just, you know, networking within a particular sector or industry or technology area. And then I think this has probably become more and more common really over the last while. How might clusters leverage advantage, or indeed address some of the grand challenges we're facing around maybe digitization, climate action, those sorts of issues? We'd see a lot of this in the EU policy. So our prioritization, I would say, has to be around one or more of the following goals, in terms of when we're thinking of what support structures we'll put in place to assist clusters. I think also the other thing I think around delivery that we need to do, and I think the report brings this out very clearly, is the idea that we're committing to a longer term funding, which at its heart, I think, and this is one of the things I think was critical in the report in terms of what we found there in the gaps, is actually as much around the kind of development of an expertise in the delivery and management of clusters. I think that's something that the literature is quite clear on. What we were finding on the ground was very clear in terms of the gaps were there, and this was something we feel needs to be considered very carefully, that it's not just about funding clusters, it's also about funding a sort of a cadre of people who can develop and deliver and manage clusters. I think the Danish example is a critical one in terms of thinking about that. And going back to that point that Kristen has just made, that clusters are around about leveraging competitive advantage for the economies, as much. It's not just about creating more clusters, it's about what leverage those can bring. A final kind of point in terms of closing the gaps, and I think measurement is a critical one here. I think a need for clarity as to what it is we're trying to achieve is, Kristen has made the point, Eleanor made the point, and we found this in the analysis and in the consultations that we did. There's still a lot of skepticism out there, you know, and in a sense, I understand that much of our industrial policy and the kind of our support for businesses has tended to be on a one-for-one basis, or one-to-one basis, I should say. So there's a comfort with that. But I think trying to think about what it is we would try and achieve by developing more clusters or better clusters, I think is something that we need to think about. And the measurement of what success might look like, I think it is key to that. Some of that is in around at firm level performance data. I think there is that, but then I've lined out, or you know, teased out a few things there that some of the evaluation work within TCI and others would identify as well: firm productivity, employment growth, innovation activity, actual survival rates of firms themselves, or a number of those being kind of key metrics that you might look for. But also, I think the other issue there, I think, to answer some of the skepticism, and indeed even to kind of think about what success we think would look like for those who are enthusiastic about clustering, is to what extent some or all of these at a firm level can be attributed to the fact that the firm is located within or engaged within clustering. I think it is a critical one, and one we need to think about going back, as I say, going back round in full circle to policy design, to program design. So I'll leave it really at that. I don't want to take up too much of the time here, but those are three of the things I think in terms of closing the gap. It's around about measurement, it's around about good design, and then it's around about kind of commitment and leadership in terms of the delivery of programs and initiatives. So I'll maybe pass back to